Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well and keeping cool or warm wherever you are in the world, keeping that temperature nicely regulated. And if that means going and getting an ice cold drink or something lovely and warm, by all means do it. And if you're drinking something very special and unusual, make sure you tell me about it. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, sometimes Mother Fate holds you gently by the hand and takes you on an unlikely journey that you never imagined for your life. A nudge here and a nudge there, she guides you gracefully down the path. And if you're reluctant to move forward, she can give you a forceful push so that you'll end up on the path that was ordained for you before you were even born. I'm in no doubt that this is what happened to me. Growing up as a young boy, there was one place I loved in town more than anywhere else, more than the old-fashioned sweet shop, more than the ice cream parlour, and more than the diner that made the best all-American burgers that you've ever tasted. If you haven't guessed yet, it was the old antique bookshop on the corner of Main Street that was reminiscent of bygone times, as the shop possessed a vintage retrograde allure. There was an emerald green awning framing the exterior windows, embossed with white italic writing that read The Wizened Friend. Then there was a magnificent display of books always in the window that would completely hijack your attention, and it was impossible not to stop and read all the beguiling new titles that would leave a book enthusiast like myself salivating. The next thing you would know is that a tiny little voice in your head would say, "I'll just go in there for a minute, only a minute, that's all." Then you would push open the glass door, and the inside silvery bell would tinkle to alert the owner, Mr. Wright, to his new customer. That was the moment when one was inclined to feel rather awkward and self-conscious, but the magnetic enticement of those books was quite literally insatiable, and easily overcame any reticence on my part, as the collective woody, smoky, earthy and vanilla aroma of this tranquil sanctuary or oasis of books was quite arresting. Mr. Wright was in his early 70s at the time. He was passionate about his little business and loved all books, whether old or new. A short man, young for his age, without a single grey hair on his head. A smooth, unlined complexion, hazel-brown eyes framed by round glasses that made him look like a wizened owl. When you entered his shops, he would study you from behind his old-fashioned cash register and address you by name. "Hello, Jamie. And how are you today, young man? What can I do for you?" he would ask. I would answer very politely and say, "I'm just looking, Mr. Wright. Just looking. Thank you very much." "Be my guest," he would say. "Give me a shout if you need my help in anything." My heart would flutter with excitement, like a child embarking on a great adventure in a playground, for that was the level of how thrilled I was to be in the spectacular place. I would glide across the cushioned plush red carpet towards the oak shelves, my fingers trembling with excitement as I opened the crisp white pages and read the dark print. I loved the sweet musky smell of the paper and the ink, which is called bibliosomia, and I would settle on a velvety couch, my body sinking back into its soft cushioning, and I would read and read and read, forgetting about the time, forgetting where I was, forgetting absolutely everything. For me it was like being on a spinning wheel and whirling away from this world, flying above the clouds into other realms, dimensions and realities. It was an escapism at its finest, time travel, exploration and adventure at the speed of an author's words. The best thing of all is you didn't need a time-travelling machine or expensive plane tickets to visit these exotic, fabulous places. Indeed, all you needed was to leave the confines of the bookshop to accomplish this extraordinary feat with just words. For me, it was the epitome of true magic. Of course, when my mother couldn't find me in the main street, she invariably knew exactly where I was and would sigh with frustration. I would be discovered buried in a recliner at the old bookshop, and she would rescue me there, her pink face flustered with embarrassment. "Oh, there you are, Jamie. I wondered where you got to, she'd scold. I thought I asked you to buy me a baker's dozen. I didn't ask you to come and read all these books. I might have known you would be here. She would then go through the motions of apologising to Mr. Wright on my behalf. Oh, I'm so sorry, Mr. Wright. When Jamie gets embroiled in one of your books, it seems that wild horses will not drag him away from his reading. Let alone his own mother, she said, raising a sarcastic eyebrow and releasing an annoying sigh to express her extreme angst and indignation. She would grab my book from me and hand it over the counter to Mr. Wright for purchase, fiddling around in her purse for the correct change, while Mr. Wright would ring out my book on his cash register and place it into a brown paper packet with the shop logo printed on its front, along with a picture of a brown owl wearing glasses and looking decidedly clever. I think she felt dutifully obligated to buying the book that I was reading, as in her opinion you never just sampled something and then replaced it on the shelf, as that was unethical and unprincipled for her. She likened reading a book and putting it back as like biting an apple at the greengrocer's and throwing it into the drum for somebody else to buy. Mr. Wright would smile warmly as he handed me my exciting package from across the counter, and he would say, "Well, that's the idea of the wizened friend. It's the quintessential place for you to get lost in the wonderful world of words and of thoughts. Your son understands and appreciates the full meaning of my shop." How I loved that bookshop, and over the years I became comfortable with the wizened friend, along with Mr. Wright, whom became like a fixture and fitting in the place, while I grew into one of his most loyal and regular customers. Main Street in our quaint little North American town was set against a backdrop of rugged countryside, exquisite mountainous views, and ubiquitous areas of natural forest. Our family home was about a 15-minute cycle ride from the town down some of those rather rocky dirt roads, and was a trip I would take very regularly, as sneaking to the bookshop became a customary event for me. Our typical farmhouse was a simplistic design, a symmetrical wooden double-storey building with sage green shutters and windows and a grey slate roof that contrasted superbly against the white panelled walls. We lived on a few acres of land, surrounded by acres of rolling verdant countryside, and it was a reasonable-sized property for our growing family. I had 3 younger sisters, but I was the oldest sibling in my family, and my parents' only son. One day when I was 18 years old, a large, sizable black Buick station wagon rolled down our driveway, and I could hear the crunching sound of the tyres squishing the pebbles beneath their thick rubber traction. Finally the car came to a screeching halt, and I glanced outside the kitchen window with an expression of extreme surprise on my face. What on earth was Mr. Wright's car doing parked outside our family home, I wondered. While we knew Mr. Wright from town, we weren't familiar with him or well acquainted with him on a social or personal level, that is. We ascertained that he did live alone, was reclusive, somewhat antisocial, and a man of few words, but a likeable, very pleasant and cordial gentleman, nevertheless. The dignified man was reputed to being a self-confessed bookaholic, and that didn't surprise me at all. It was rumoured that he read 1 book a day, but I could do that, so it wouldn't surprise me at all. I could hear the car door slam behind him and the heavy tread of his shoes crunching the gravel beneath his feet as he finally approached our sage-green front door, and then we heard the golden knocker rapping a few times. Our 2 jet-black Scottish terriers, Sooty and Midnight, were wagging their tails excitedly and barking in unison together, as my mother, still wearing her hair curlers and an avocado face mask, scurried to the front door to answer it. I could discern that she was somewhat caught off guard to see Mr. Wright standing there at the front doorstep, as her voice failed to conceal its element of surprise. "Oh, hello, Mr. Wright," I could hear her say. "Oh, please excuse my dreadful appearance. I didn't expect anybody to come over now. I could possibly scare the living dead in this grotesque face mask of mine. Now this is a lovely unexpected surprise. For what do I owe this wonderful pleasure?" "You look fine, if I may say so," said Mr. Wright very politely. "I'd like to speak to you and your son Jamie together, if I may. It is a matter of the utmost importance and urgency that requires your immediate and very prompt attention." "Please come through," said my mother, gesturing Mr. Wright to the living area, and indicating for the man to take a seat on the recliner. "You stay there," she said, raising her hand in a stop signal, rather like you see at a pedestrian crossing. "I just need to wash off this face mask quickly, rustle up some tea for the both of you, and call Jamie." "That would be very lovely," said Mr. Wright. "I'll be waiting for you right here. And don't rush on my account. I'm a very patient man." Before long, I was seated in a large recliner opposite Mr. Wright, while my mother began to pour cups of tea into teacups, and she was rather clumsy in this manner of protocol, as the teacups rattled precariously in her hands. "How do you like your tea, Mr. Wright?" she asked. "White with no sugar would be very, very nice," he said. She poured him his tea and handed it over to him, her fingers seemingly rather unsteady. As we began to sip the hot, steamy beverage, my mother and I pinned our eyes on Mr. Wright expectantly, waiting for him to take the lead in the conversation. I noticed his fingers wobbled as he placed down his teacup on the side table and peered at us both earnestly through his round spectacles, with a look of grave concern upon his face. "I am dying," he announced. "It's a very advanced form of prostate cancer, I'm afraid. I haven't got much time left," he said. "Maybe days, weeks, or possibly months," he shrugged. "Who knows?" At this point, my mother's mouth opened, and she gawked at Mr. Wright in astonishment, seemingly surprised that a man of his reticence would divulge such personal information to us about himself. "Oh, my gosh! I'm so sorry, Mr. Wright. That's dreadful, dreadful news. I don't honestly know what on earth to say. Is there nothing that they can do for you? Like chemotherapy, radiation? You know that. All those kind of things." "It's too late for all of that," said Mr. Wright, shrugging his shoulders with an air of indifference. "The way I see it, Mrs. Anderson, when it's your time to go, it's your time." Oh dear, said my mother, tuttering away. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Wright. If there's anything that we can do, please don't hesitate to ask." "Well, there is something you can do, actually," he said, his eyes now homing in on me. "Well, it all depends on what your son Jamie has to say about my proposition." "Jamie," said my mother, looking flummoxed. Why would this concern him, Mr. Wright?" "It concerns him greatly," said Mr. Wright. "Your son rather reminds me of myself when I was his age. He has a fervent passion for books. I wonder," he said, looking at me directly, "if you would consider carrying on with my legacy by being the next owner of the Wizened Friend. I know it's a lot to think about, and to consider, of course, but I'd like you to think about it. Because when I'm gone, I would like that bookshop to still remain open in Main Street for as long as possible. And I would like to think of it being run by someone who loves books as much as you do." "Mr. Wright," said my mother, looking awkward, "I don't think we could afford to buy your bookshop, even if we wanted to. And this is Jamie's future we're talking about. While he loves books, I'm sure, I'm not quite certain that his aspirations are aligned towards owning a bookshop. Maybe he wants to do something else with his life." "Ah, well, that's why I'm here. I'd like to sign over my estate to your son, if I may, if of course he's in agreement with my proposal. I have no intention of asking you to buy the shop, of course, but if your son can assure me that running the bookshop in Main Street would be something that he could envisage for his future in the short term, then I would feel secure in the knowledge that the Wizened Friend is in the best of hands, and that will rest very well with my heart most happily." It was my turn to look befuddled and thrilled, as this was all my dreams coming to fulfilment at once. I couldn't think of anything in the world I'd rather do than run my own bookshop, especially the Wizened Friend. I'd never thought about owning a bookshop before. The idea hadn't even crossed my mind, but the thought of spending every day surrounded by books was quite simply my idea of heaven. "Mr. Wright! Mr. Wright!" I said, my eyes sparkling with excitement and my face lighting up in a joyous, gleeful expression. "I'd love to be the next owner of the Wizened Friend. It would be a dream come true for me. I've never thought of owning a bookshop before, but thinking about it now, I couldn't think of anything I'd really love better. I mean, I'm in shock. It's so generous of you to do this kind thing for me. I don't really know what to say.
I thought as much, said Mr. Wright. I had no doubt in my mind that would be your answer, and it's only a pleasure to leave the wizened friend in such agreeable hands. From the moment you walked into my bookshop with your wide, excited eyes, I knew you were the one to carry on the legacy. I'll teach you all the ropes on how to run the place before I finally pop my clogs, he joked.
And he was true to his word, and taught me everything I needed to know about seamlessly running a bookshop, and in those weeks I realised I had truly discovered my calling. And so it was at the young tender age of a mere 18, to the envy of all my friends, I was running my own bookshop in Main Street, after poor Mr. Wright had finally died on July the 4th of 1982. I made absolutely sure that to honour his legacy and his memory, that the Wizened Friend became the most beguiling shop in Main Street, and I certainly achieved that aim. I would even leave the shop doors open when the whole town was snowed in, and people were trapped in their homes due to the bad weather. It was at times like this when all the other shops in Main Street were invariably closed, except the Wizened Friend. Anyone who fancied a trip to town on the back of their snowmobile, or wearing a hardy pair of snowshoes, could always pop into my shop to buy a book, and the irony is that they often did, because there is nothing better than reading a book in freezing weather by a crackling warm fire. I would light up the wood-burning stove in the shop and offer my customers warm cups of hot cocoa, and I would sleep in the back room there, where I possessed my own kitchenette with an old-fashioned stove and refrigerator along with a cosy bed. So it wasn't uncommon for me to sleep overnight at the Wizened Friend, which I occasionally did. Fast forward to when I was about 22 years old, and during the middle of the day the sun just disappeared behind a grey, gloomy, overcast sky, and a vast frosty stillness fell over the town, as the bleak Siberian winter weather had taken a circumpolar, rather nasty turn, and the snow began falling down heavily, like white feathers descending from the heavenlies, swathing the world in a thick, luxurious carpet of exquisite white snow. I would light up the wood-burning stove in the shop, to make it delightfully warm, cosy and welcoming, and offer my customers lovely hot cups of cocoa, and I would sleep in the back room there, where I possessed my own lovely kitchenette, with an old-fashioned stove and refrigerator, along with a cosy bed, so it wasn't uncommon for me to sleep over at the Wizened Friend, and I often did. Fast forward to when I was about 22 years old, and during the middle of the day, the sun just disappeared behind a grey, gloomy, overcast sky, and a vast, frosty stillness fell over the town, as the bleak Siberian winter weather had taken a circumpolar, rather nasty turn. The snow began falling down heavily, like white feathers descending from the heavenlies, swathing the world in a thick, luxurious carpet of exquisite white snow, blanketing the ponderosa pines and Douglas firs, transforming them into fragile, delicate and ethereal trees that spoke of white Christmases, stockings hanging on the hearth, warm mulled wine, mince pies, and delicious frothy glasses of eggnog. The bell of my shop tinkled as the young woman entered it with her woolly hat covering her ears and her body shaking with the cold. "Hello, Mrs. Brown," I said. "It's freezing out there. What are you doing in town right now? Aren't all the shops closed yet? You shouldn't be out in this blistering cold weather. You'll catch your death of cold." "Well, the baker's only just closed his doors right now," said Mrs. Brown. "I couldn't leave town without buying his delicious cinnamon buns, because they're so delectable, just out of the oven, served piping hot. I thought I'd pop in to buy a book to keep me busy at home," she said, "as I fancy sitting by a cosy fire, reading while we're snowed in like this." "Oh, it's so lovely and warm in here," she said, making a quick dart towards the wood-burning stove and warming her hands against the glass panel that reflected the bright yellow flames of the crackling fire on its inside grate. "You better be careful, Jamie. If you make this bookshop of yours any more cosier, no one will ever want to leave it. It's as warm as toast in here. I think I might just move in," she teased. "That's the whole idea," I said, smiling at my customer warmly. "Can I brew you a nice warm cup of hot chocolate?"
"Now you're talking," she said, as she began to study the lines of books along the shelves. "Now the big question is, what do I want to read? A detective, a mystery, or a romance novel? I can't quite decide." In a short period of time, 3 more people had gathered in my cosy bookshop, inspired by exactly the same idea as Mrs. Brown, about buying books to read by the fire. So they piled in my shop to get warm, drink some hot chocolate, and select a book that they fancied to read. So it seemed like the feisty, spirited winter conditions were not having any adverse impact on my business. On the contrary, the reverse was true. Finally, at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I closed my doors and sat by the wood-burning stove, reclining comfortably in the springy sofa, allowing its sumptuous cushioning to bolster me up, whilst I was swaddled under the cosy warmth of a white fluffy blanket, with the shop cat Tabitha curled up snugly on my lap. One day she just swaggered into my shop with an air of authority, almost as if she owned the place. I remember she jumped on the settee, making herself feel very comfortable, and her long, sleek grey body curling up contentedly by the cosy fire. From thenceforth she moved into the shop, revelling in the attention of admiring, adoring customers who would swoon around her, saying, "Oh, she's so beautiful! Oh, my word, what a delightful cat you have!" The trouble was that Tabitha knew she was beautiful, and there were many times she would sit on the bathroom counter staring in wondrous awe at her reflection, as truly her vanity knew no bounds. She certainly thrived on all the perks I bestowed on her, like cooked chicken and fresh salmon. I truly think she thought she ran the wizened friend, and I was her butler waiting on her hand and foot. I admit I couldn't help myself from spoiling her rotten, and besides, she had so quickly and seamlessly become a big attraction to the store, and a quintessential asset to the shop, and I'm sure, in a subconscious way, she played her part in increasing the sales figures. I must confess the constant spoiling had indeed upholstered her anatomy quite significantly, making her irresistibly cuddly, and even more endearing to her flocking admirers that were growing steadily by the day into a sizable fan club. People were much more inclined to ask after her than inquire about me. I was intent on staying overnight at the shop on this particular occasion, while the heavy snow and winter conditions continued outside. I would open my doors in the morning, I thought, to those brave, bold and audacious enough to endure the cutting, benumbed elements. I was finding the winter weather tended to permeate all my outdoor clothes with a potent iciness that was so cold it actually burnt. I could hear the howling winds escalate and increase in magnitude outside the confines of my shop. When you've surrounded yourself with a warm, cosy fire and very agreeable creature comforts, it can be oddly gratifying, cheering and consolatory listening to the wind outside, as you are so safely contained in your cosy little bubble, while the world outside your cushioned secure space is in turbulent upheaval. I could hear the raucous, vacillating wind roaring and dropping in frequency to a gentle whispering sound, whilst the exterior panel of glass to my shop rattled and quaked, creating a clamorous jolting that was somewhat unsettling. I was very glad indeed not to be caught up in the midst of this unpleasant blizzard. A gentle, ethereal light remained on in the wizened friend all night, and in the throes of reading my novel, sleep finally overcame me. My eyes gently rolled shut, like the blinders on a window. The lids relaxed, and the contours of my face significantly loosened, as I drifted off into the engaging world of my dreams. I was awoken to a strange, rather peculiar rattling sound that I couldn't quite identify, but I assumed it was the wailing wind stepping up its motion. I glanced briefly at my watch. Goodness, I thought, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. I must have fallen asleep while I was reading. I realised that Tabitha had long since left her comfortable sleeping spot and was now standing only yards away from the shop window, her yellow-green eyes looking fixedly at something. Even her long coat of grey hair had literally doubled in its size and was standing up on edge, and her tail was thrashing up and down violently like a rider's whip, whilst her ears were pinned back. I could hear a very strange, rather peculiar sound emanating from the back of her throat that sounded like a growl, a hiss or a snarl, followed by a long drawn-out meow. It was clear she could see something that my eyes had missed, and whatever it was causing her a measure of distress. In a trice I instinctively moved towards the window to see what it was that had upset her. Then I saw it. It was a dark, shadowy figure, a massive silhouette of a Herculean-sized human form covered in hair, with a large leathery face pinned against the window, the large flat nose smudging the glass. Whatever it was, it appeared exceedingly curious, possibly drawn to the inside pearly light that illuminated the entire shop in a subtle and pretty luminescence, and it was obviously inquisitively looking into the shop window for a closer inspection. All of a sudden its eyes met mine, and he held my gaze for a second, no more than a fleeting second, of course, and then he began to glide away. I don't know what I was actually thinking, for indeed I doubt I engaged any thoughts at all, but I did react as I would have done with anyone showing an interest in my bookshop. I quickly grabbed my coat, throwing it over my shoulders, and hurriedly slipped on my snowshoes, whilst attaching my headlight to my head and opening the shop door to brave the sub-zero glacial weather conditions and the blistering wind that was blowing against my face, whilst I ran after the strange, unfamiliar creature. It was like any common sense had eluded me, and I wasn't sure what I was doing, but I ran after the mysterious stranger without even an ounce of trepidation, and looking back, I often wonder why. I glanced down at the long trail of oversized footprints that were deeply entrenched in the snow, and was completely astounded by the size of these things. They trailed down the street towards the back of the shop, over a long field towards the woodgrove that fringed the rear of the shops on Main Street. Of course, the forest no longer exists there today, as the trees were eventually bulldozed to create more shops in the area, but when I was young, those forests stretched back for many miles. I bolted after the creature, increasing my speed somewhat. Whatever it was, it appeared to be in no hurry, and although it was taking its time to walk casually towards the woods, while it was swinging its arms backwards and forwards, its stride was equivalent to about 5 of my feet. As I ran in the thick snow, I slowed down my pace significantly, while the icy blizzards of wind thundered brutally against my face, stinging my skin like a sandstorm. But I remain unfazed. Nothing could suppress my eager enthusiasm to observe this strange creature, for I knew in my gut that I might never encounter it again, and I had a huge fascination for the unexplained and the mysterious. I was breathing rapidly, my heart thumping in my ears, as I finally caught up to the creature. I think I was possibly about 2 feet behind him, and he possibly hadn't heard me, as the panelling wind was a noisy distraction that certainly subdued the squeaking sound of my boots, silencing my quiet and cautious approach. All of a sudden the creature sniffed the air, as if he could discern my scent, and then slowly he stopped on his tracks and turned around, swivelling his huge upper torso to look directly at me. And when he saw me, his facial expression was one of total and utter bewilderment. He was surprised that I'd been foolish enough to stalk him, and surprised that he hadn't heard my feeble approach. I think the element of surprise was certainly my greatest advantage, for this creature was not quite sure how to react to me. I discerned the furrows, or train tracks if you like, on the creature's forehead, deepened in intensity, into what I can only describe as a puzzled, perturbed expression, with an almost a look of "What do you want?" written on his face. I wasn't prepared for what I was seeing, and I have no idea what I was actually expecting to see. But this tall and ample-sized creature was most certainly built like a monstrous giant, towering at about 9 foot tall, and easily over 700 pounds, and 4 feet wide across the shoulder area. Nothing, and I mean nothing, prepares you for facing a creature of such monstrous size that is built with such powerful muscular density that would intimidate even a large predator. This creature's Herculean barrel-sized body was bounteously swathed in a luxurious thick coat of jet black hair that contrasted so dramatically and dynamically against the stark whiteness of the snow. I could see him clearly in the light of my headlamp. In my opinion, his face was so human, as was the physical alignment of his entire body, with of course the exception of his overlong arms and his pyramid-shaped head. It was in that moment, when the creature's eyes met mine, that I realised with horror that I'd run towards an apex predator, rather like a mouse to a tabby cat, almost as if I was offering myself on a dinner plate for him. In a trice my heart jumped into my throat and began beating violently in my ears, while chills of dread ran down my spine. To my amazement, the creature appeared totally non-aggressive, and rolled up a piece of snow in front of my eyes, barely bending his knees in the process due to the length of his arms.
The creature appeared to chuckle as he threw the snowball at me, with a teasing, playful look in his eyes that challenged me. I was shocked, completely and totally shocked. He actually wanted to play with me. Perhaps he'd seen children throwing snowballs together, I thought, for the long field behind the shops of Main Street was often used by the youngsters to throw snowballs at each other in the winter months and to have snowman competitions. I was certain that the creature had been eyewitness to these games, possibly having observed them as a youngling and longing to take part in the fun and games for himself. Now was his chance, I thought, rolling up a snowball and throwing it at him. Before long, we were having the time of our lives, throwing snowballs at each other, and the snowball fight of my life. But the creature increased the fun of the games by indicating where I should aim the ball. He pointed towards his elbow, but I missed over and over again. But when I pointed to an area on my body for the creature to throw the snowball at, he hit the bullseye every single time, as his hand-to-eye coordination was completely astonishing. Suddenly, standing there in the tree line of the Douglas firs that fringed the edges of the forest, I discerned a tall, solitary figure watching us. When the creature that was playing with me saw the strange creature standing there silently observing us, he looked like a little boy who'd been caught with his hand in the cookie jar, and without looking at me, he glided hurriedly towards the figure. And this creature began to talk to him fast, backwards and forwards, in a language that sounded like Cantonese, and the tone of her voice reminded me of a belligerent headmistress, and I say her because the voice sounded female. I think the creature was getting into trouble for playing games with me, and it's a distinct possibility, as I never ever got to see him again, which I seriously regret. All this happened a very long time ago, and the creature I encountered in the early hours of the morning was without doubt a male Bigfoot, with a youthful energy, and to date the snowball game with that Bigfoot has never ever been trumped by anybody else. For many long years I ran the Wise and Friend bookshop, which were among the best years of my life, thanks to Mr. Wright. But after a bad motorcycle accident upon which I lost one of my legs, I was unable to reopen the shop. But to this very day, I believe running that bookshop was my greatest life calling. But now I'm on a different journey, but books of every kind are still my biggest passion. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, I just loved that story. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, goodbye and good night.